Hi everyone, Brett here. A couple of months ago I asked you on my Facebook page what else you'd like to see rather than me just posting images all the time. And many responded or messaged that a tutorial on how I process some of my images would be something that they would like to see. And so I thought I would include a tutorial on how I process several of my night images. And I think we'll go ahead and start with the image that you see in front of you right now. This was an image taken in Utah this past May using a Canon 5D Mark III, my trusty Nikon 14 to 24 f2.8 lens. And the exposure time on this was 25 seconds and it was shot at 6400 ISO. But this tutorial really isn't as much about shooting this image as it is on how to process it, or at least how I process these. And there are literally an infinite number of ways to process these. There's not really any right way or a wrong way per se. But through this tutorial, at first what I'm going to do is show you how to process or how I process the raw images of this. And then after we're done with the raw image and we export it to a TIFF file, I'll show you what I then do in Photoshop to get the final completed image. So we're going to go ahead and open up the raw file here. Okay, as you see in front of you, I have the raw file open. I am using Adobe Camera Raw. You can also use Lightroom. They're both basically the same thing, the same raw engine inside of them. And as you can see from the raw image, that it's really looking pretty bland, isn't it? In the raw image, there's no processing done. There's no contrast, no saturation. There's no sort of in-camera processing at all. It's just pure raw data. And then our job with this is to go ahead and pull the data out of the image that we want to be able to show. And it's an important distinction to know that in this raw image, when we make these adjustments, we're not creating anything that wasn't actually there. We are either selectively enhancing or pulling out all the data that's contained within that image to be able to show, most specifically in this image, the brightest parts of the Milky Way. So the first thing I always start on is figuring out the white balance of the night shot. That's one of the more critical items. We can choose a warmer white balance, or we can choose a cooler one that tends to turn the sky a little bit more blue. A lot of people have different thoughts on which way to go on this. I usually like to pick something in the middle. So when you adjust this temperature here, we'll make this a little bit cooler because it's looking quite a bit warm. That's getting pretty close there. Why don't we go ahead and keep that temperature at 3900 Kelvin. And as far as the tint goes, we need to take this a little ways away from the magenta, bring it back a little bit more neutral. That should be good right about there. And so the next thing is to go down through the other basic sliders on this. The exposure on this one looks pretty good to me. The foreground could be a little bit lighter, but we'll take care of that later. Recovery should be good. Let's go ahead and try and add in just a little bit of fill light. Try and bring out a little bit in the shadows while turning the blacks down so they aren't quite as deep. That looks pretty good right there. And we'll definitely need to turn the contrast up. Let's put this, I usually shoot for somewhere in the 45 to 50 range on these types of images. That usually works out pretty well. And then the clarity slider is one of the more powerful ones for star images. If you turn the clarity way up, you'll notice that a lot of these stars really start to pop, and they can almost overpower the Milky Way in here. And so what I usually like to do is select something a little bit closer to zero. If you go too low on it, it creates more of a, I don't want to say blurry look to it, but it creates a much more soft image. And so let's go ahead and try and take this back somewhere in the middle. We'll put it about on 0. And then vibrance and saturation, I'm usually up in the anywhere in the 15 range or so. With night images, you really don't want to overdo it too much. So now that we're done with the basic adjustments, we'll go over here to the tone curve section. where we can independently adjust the highlights, lights, darks, and shadows. Now, one of the best parts about this slider is that the highlights section will really concentrate on the brightest area of the Milky Way right in here. So we're really going to try and bring out this as much as possible. So we're going to slide these quite a ways to the right without really overdoing it, otherwise it'll make the stars start to pop more. And you notice as I slide this to the right, the brightest region right in here of the Milky Way starts to get a little bit brighter. And you know what, before I go too much into the tone curve, why don't we go ahead and first create a little bit more contrast in the sky to really make this start to pop, make the dark sky a little bit darker and the lighter parts of the Milky Way a little bit brighter. So we'll go up here to our adjustment brush, we'll create a new one. Let's make this a little bit bigger. That's better. Let's go ahead and set the exposure down to about 0, because I don't really want to affect that much. But let's really crank up the saturation here. Let's try about somewhere in the 35-ish range. So now what I'm going to do is just go through here and paint over the entire sky to locally apply this contrast adjustment here. And I'm not going to get too exact with this. We'll just get it a little bit close to the arch here. Concentrate mainly just on the better parts of the sky. And you can see how as I paint this in, the Milky Way starts to pop a bit more in there. It's a lot easier to see it against a darker background when you're adding that contrast in. And I think what I'll also do is maybe darken the darker parts of the sky a little bit, just so we can make it pop a little bit more later. That's pretty good. So we'll be done with that and go back to the tone curves. Now as I adjust this highlights, you can really see it start to pop out a little bit more. So we'll adjust this up a bit and maybe go a little bit up on the lights as well, maybe only about 5 or 6 or so. And darks, to add a little bit more contrast, we'll go ahead and lower those just a bit. That looks about good. Shadows we can probably leave. I don't want to make anything that's too dark any darker. So then continuing on through our tab layer up here, do the sharpening. You can usually go ahead and do this to taste. I usually go in the 30 range. And then for the noise reduction, usually for this camera on the 6400 ISO settings, usually about 30 is good. You can do more later if you want, but there's really not a whole lot of need for it. Now we're going to go into the Hue Saturation and Luminance slider, and this is a pretty powerful one for night images as well to help you control the color balance a bit. In this, as far as saturation goes, maybe turn down the oranges a little bit just to try and get rid of some of the light pollution over here, though we can do that a little bit later as well. I'm just going to turn that down a bit, maybe -7 or so. Then we'll go into the luminance, and what I want to do here is kind of brighten up some of the areas of the foreground arch. When I was light painting with this, it was with a pretty warm flashlight, and it was also reflected off of some of the red rock around there, so the reds and oranges are really strong with that. And so to try and offset some of that deeper saturation, I'm going to increase the luminance on these a little bit. So we're going to increase the red up, we'll say somewhere around there. We'll go with the oranges, maybe somewhere up in that same range. You see how the orange really affects it. So we'll put that up about here. Yellow, probably don't need to do a whole heck of a lot there. There's not going to be a lot of yellow in this, besides maybe in the Milky Way, so we can turn that up a little bit. And greens. Greens will usually be more in the way of air glow, or even closer to the horizon, which I don't usually like to see a whole lot of in mine, so I'm going to turn that down just a little bit. And that should about do it for this. So moving on through, split toning, we don't usually have to do anything with that. Lens effects, this is to get rid of any distortion or vignetting. and we will go down and click on my Nikon 14 to 24, and we'll just leave it at 100% of the distortion and vignetting. We'll also click to remove the chromatic aberrations. Those might occur in some of the star areas. And so as far as the raw image goes, that's about all we have to do as far as the basic adjustments. For this image, because my flashlight was over to the right, as you can kind of tell, the middle portion of the foreground is quite a bit lighter than the area over on the left-hand side. So I think what I'm going to do is take my Grad Filter tool up here, increase the exposure up. Let's try 0.2 to start out with. Take the contrast back down, and we're going to draw in a grad filter over here to try and bring back a little bit of light to the area of the foreground that was darker before. It looks pretty good. We can click the preview button up here to toggle in between. Let's go up to 0.25, a little bit more. And I think that should about do it. So there you have it. We've already have a pretty good looking image right now just out of the raw conversions, and we'll improve on this even more in Photoshop. So what I'm going to do is just save the image and go ahead and export it as a TIFF file, so it's a lossless format. I don't like exporting to JPEGs yet anyway. And after we get this saved, we'll go ahead and open it up in Photoshop. Alright, so now that I've got the image opened up in Photoshop, the real fun can begin. The first thing that I'm going to do is try and target just the area right around the brightest parts of the Milky Way in here, and really get the lighter areas to pop out against the darker areas of the galaxy. And the way I'm going to do that is with a curves layer. First thing I'm going to do though is come over here to the background layer and duplicate it. I usually do this just so I have a backup copy in case I ever need it in there. So the original right here isn't damaged at all. And so what I'm going to do is come up here, create a curves layer. This will allow me to target just specific areas like the lightest areas, and specifically target the darkest areas as well within the same adjustment layer. But the first thing I'm going to do is get a gradient tool, go up to the top left, do a split gradient, or a reflected gradient as it's called. And what I'm going to do is create a gradient that the layer mask applies mostly to the center area, and as you go away from it, it fades out so the effects don't apply as much. So the axis of our Milky Way is somewhere in this neighborhood right here, and I want to be 90 degrees perpendicular to that. So I'm going to pull this off at about 90 degrees, come out here to about where I want this effect to end. Right here is probably good, and create that gradient. Now the way to tell is if I drew that on the right line or not, come over here to the channels, select that mask, and that's pretty darn good effort there. In fact, I may want to tilt it just a little bit more counterclockwise than that. And so we'll go back here, just undo that gradient, and we'll try maybe about this and see how this turns out. There, that's better. So now that we got that curves layer in there, I also want this only to apply to this area of the sky, and I don't want it to apply anywhere in the foreground. So we're also going to do a quick mask around all the foreground areas to make sure that any of our adjustments that we want to apply to the sky aren't applied to the foreground. So what I'm doing is using my lasso tool to get around these. Go up to the refine edge, pick a big enough radius so that it encompasses all the edges I want it to choose. That should be pretty good. And let Photoshop do its thing. Alright, so that makes a pretty good selection of my foreground area. On my mask, I'm now going to turn that using the fill command to black so that none of my changes apply to it. Deselected, and I'm good to go. So back onto the curves layer, like I mentioned earlier, I want to increase the brightness of the brightest parts and decrease the brightness of some of the shadow areas just a little bit. So we're going to come up here, and on the right side of your curves diagram or your histogram up here are the brightest areas, and on the left side are the darkest areas. So if I want to increase the brightness of the brighter areas, I'll go ahead and click this up to begin with. And then as I go back down, I don't want the shadows to be so bright, so I'll click another point in here to tell that curve to get back closer to its native luminance. And so go through here and go ahead and just fool around with this curves layer a little bit to get it to show up the way we want to. You notice as I do that, the curve right here dips down below the native line so that the darkers are also getting, or the darkest tones are also getting dark. I don't want to go quite that much, so we'll bring these back up a little bit. Let me choose this area up a bit more to really get the brightest areas in there to really pop and show up well. And you see the difference that curves layer has made. Turning it off and then turning it back on, it really increases the contrast in this area really well. Makes that Milky Way pop up quite a bit more. So now that I've got that rough curves layer done, we can come in here and use the dodge and burn commands to selectively make a few of these little tougher to get areas brighter and make some of the darker areas where we want them a little bit darker. So with our selection now on the background copy, we'll come over here. Let's start off first with the dodge tool, which will make the highlights up here areas brighter. Start off with a really low exposure because the dodge command can be pretty powerful. And we're just going to go in and kind of paint over some of the areas that we want to get a little bit brighter. And again, we're not really recreating any new data. We're not showing something that's not there. We're just getting these to show up a little bit better so that they can really pop out against that darker sky background. So after you come in here, do a little bit of dodge and burning in some of these brighter parts in here that you want to show up better. We'll come over here to the burn command, make this a little bit smaller, and we'll choose the shadows because we want to make the shadows a little bit darker. Let's take that exposure back down to about 1%. And now we're going to paint over some of the darker areas to really get those to contrast well with the brighter areas. And I'm just painting over that right now. There, that's looking pretty good. I feel like Bob Ross as I'm painting into these right now. We're just going to paint a happy little Milky Way right in there. That looks pretty good. So if we were to go back and redo or undo a lot of our history, we can see a lot of the changes that we made and how some of those shadows have gotten darker, and it really contrasts a lot better now. So now that we've got a lot of our sky done, you can see we've got a pretty good Milky Way showing up right now in our image, but there's still a little bit of work we can do on our foreground here as well. For instance, this area right underneath the arch, you can see even in a dark area like Canyonlands National Park, there's still always got to be a little bit of light pollution on the horizon. So we're going to try and get rid of some of that a little bit here. And the way we'll do that is with a Hue and Saturation layer. So I'll go ahead and click on the Hue Saturation, and right now the layer mask is all white, which means it would apply to everything in our image, but we don't want that. We just want to select this little area of sky underneath the arch right here. So we are going to go back to our lasso command, select this area of sky underneath the arch, refine our edge to get everything nice and perfect. Then what I'm going to do is select the inverse of this, so instead it selects everything else but that, and I'm going to fill that in my layer mask with black so that the only areas this hue saturation layer applies to is right underneath this arch. And then under the hue saturation we are going to first select reds, and we can take the saturation on those down a bit. It's probably not going to affect it a whole heck of a lot. You can see if I increase the saturation and decrease it how it looks. We just need to decrease that a little bit. But the yellows are where we really want to decrease the saturation, as most of this light pollution is on the yellow channel. So if we increase it, you can see how much it highlights it. If we decrease it, it gets rid of a lot of that light pollution down there. So we're going to leave this somewhere around in here will be good. So now that we've got the sky pretty well taken care of, we can go ahead and focus on the foreground a little bit better. And so what we'll do with that is we'll create yet another adjustment layer. This time we'll go ahead and I think let's just globally brighten up this foreground a little bit. So we'll go ahead and select the levels adjustment layer, and we'll come in here and select, using the lasso tool again, all of our foreground elements. Just like that. And then we're going to want to subtract out the area of the sky underneath the arch, so we'll subtract this area. Go up to our refine edge. Let Photoshop do its work. That looks pretty good. I'll select the inverse of it to select all the sky areas, and then I want to turn these to black in my layer mask. So now if you look at the layer mask over here, the only white portions are on our foreground. So up here in our levels dialog box, let's try and shifting this a little bit. Maybe 1.05 will work or so. If we turn this on and off, we can see that we've brightened up our foreground just a bit. And then also, I think I'm going to, you know how I mentioned earlier in our raw version that this area was pretty dark compared to the rest of the foreground. I think I'm going to brighten this up a little bit more as well. So let's go ahead and create another levels adjustment layer. This one we can go ahead and do another gradient on, except this one will just be a standard gradient. And going from white to black, we'll go ahead and let's make it about like that. See what this does for us. And we're going to increase this up a bit. There we go. That's getting it a little bit brighter. So we can turn that off, turn it back on, see what it does for us. And if I really wanted to do this correctly, I would then apply the layer mask from the first levels layer as well, so I don't get any of that adjustment right up here in the sky area, but I'm not real concerned about getting everything perfect at this point. And so with that done, we have a pretty good image of the foreground arch and a really bright Milky Way in a dark sky. So that is how, as far as just a generic processing goes, that is how I do a lot of my night image photography. The main thing is the curves layer focused on the Milky Way, lots of contrast up in the sky, and then adjust the foreground however you need to get the correct luminance on it. So I hope everyone's enjoyed this. If you have any questions, feel free to post them or message me, or if you have any other suggestions for tutorials or things you'd like me to post, feel free to ask anytime. Thanks.